Socialism is the political ideology that a central national government ought to oversee and control all aspects of the economy rather than leaving private businesses and individuals to conduct their business and affairs as they see fit. It's rooted in the notion that all property and wealth are to be shared, and the national government is the entity which determines how they are to be shared. Well, of necessity, socialism demands a strong, centralized government able to be functional in this sense. Well, those who argue in favor of socialism will often claim that it's the fairest way for a society to function economically, and that it protects poor citizens from oppression by wealthy individuals and big corporations. Many will even attempt to use the Bible in order to defend this idea, hence the reason why we're discussing it on our program today. One alleged example of socialism that is commonly given is that of the early Christians who sold their property to share with those who were in need, as we read in Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45, and also Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 35. A 2018 Gallup poll found that 37% of Americans had a positive view of socialism, and among young Americans between the ages of 18 and 29, 51% have a positive view of socialism, compared to 45% who view capitalism as being positive. Socialism requires civil government to take on a greatly expanded role. Therefore, socialism imposes a greater tax and regulatory burden upon the people. But what does the Bible say? Well, the Bible says that God has ordained a limited role for civil authorities. This is important when people start attempting to make biblical arguments about what government ought to be doing. The divinely ordained role for civil authorities is simply to punish evildoers, to protect the innocent from those evildoers, Romans 13 verses 3 through 4, but also to maintain an environment in which people are free to serve the Lord, 1 Timothy 2 and verse 2. Now, while it may be true that all governments do many good things that go beyond this limited role, we ought to be very cautious of expecting, requesting, or demanding anything beyond what God has ordained. The Bible warns us of dangers presented by a strong, centralized government. When the Israelites were calling for a king, God told Samuel to warn them what it would be like to have a king, that he would take from them everything he wanted in order to fulfill his own purposes, 1 Samuel 8 verses 9 through 17. And then we see Solomon warning, if you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight, for one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them, Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 8. He was describing how large bureaucracies are inefficient and effective regardless of their intention. And this type of centralized power is necessarily inherent in socialism. But the blessings that we enjoy in this life, friends, they come from God, including the abundance of the wealthy. Solomon described the riches of the wealthy as the gift of God in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 19. Paul told Timothy to remind the rich. Incidentally, Timothy's primary audience would have been Christians, and he was told to warn them that God is the one that richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. It is not by the amassing of man and man's efforts. God is the one who richly supplies us with all things. But socialism, due to the size and the scope of the government needed for it, naturally results in civil authorities attempting to usurp the authority of God over the people. And this has been a problem throughout history. We read about it quite often in the biblical record. But too often, man wants to be in the place of God. And rulers who attempt to portray themselves as a benevolent, God-like figure to the people often expect the allegiance, obedience, and praise that ought to be reserved for God alone. But socialism gives incentives and rewards for sinful behavior to the harm of those who do what's right. Paul wrote, if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10. Yet socialism is built upon a system of taking from the productive and giving to the unambitious. Solomon said that it was evil and a severe affliction for possessions to be taken from one who received them as God's blessings and give them to another. Ecclesiastes 6 verses 1 and 2. Rather than one having his possessions taken by force to help others, he should be encouraged to sell what he has, that others might be able to use those things to fulfill a need. Proverbs 11 and verse 26. A voluntary free market interaction rather than a forced confiscation of property to be redistributed in an inefficient, wasteful manner, or give of his own free will in order to help others. So what's the bottom line? Nearly all human governments go beyond the limited role that God has ordained for them. However, the political ideology of socialism is built upon the premise that human rulers can take the place of God over the people, and this provides special challenges for Christians who live in such a society. Friends, we thank you for joining us for our program today. Please consider these things and have a blessed day.